Google and Yahoo announced that they will enforce stricter requirements to authenticate emails. Not meeting these requirements may lead to failed delivery of emails, or they may be marked as spam. By now, you might have received a lot of reminders to set this up. And because we use different tech to send our emails, their instructions may be confusing and worse, conflicting. Hence, this video will be helpful for you if you've either haven't done any actions yet, but would like to know what gaps to fill and steps to take, or you've already followed steps from your email provider, but unsure if it was set up correctly. The blanket requirement for any email sender is for our emails across sources to be properly authenticated. Now let's define two things. First, what are email sources? Our emails can come from a spectrum of sources. Here are the main categories. We have direct emails, marketing emails, and transactional emails. Here are the tools or tech that we use for each category. We typically send direct emails via Google Workspace, Microsoft, or Yahoo Mail. Then marketing emails are sent via ESPs or email service providers. Here are some examples: ConvertKit, Flowdesk, Squarespace Email, Kajabi, MailerLite, ActiveCampaign, MailChimp, and a lot more. Then if we sell online or accept payments online, then we typically send transactional emails. These can come from our website host, or CRM, or payment gateways like Squarespace, Shopify, Dubsado, or Honeybook. Note that these are just examples. There's quite a lot more email sources. Essentially, they are the ones that we use to send emails on our brand's behalf. Now that we've defined what email sources are, let's now look into what being properly authenticated means. There's a misconception that authentication only applies to bulk email senders. But in fact, this authentication applies to all emails. It's just that the level of authentication is stricter for bulk senders. Now let's define what a bulk sender is. Based on Google's documentation, a bulk sender is any sender that sends close to 5,000 emails or more within a 24-hour period. Note that it will count each recipient as one email. So if you send a marketing campaign to a list of close to or more than 5,000 recipients, then you will count as a bulk sender. Now, what's important to note is once an email sender is classified as bulk sender, it is permanent. So even if you lessen the volume of emails that you send in a day, your classification as a bulk sender will not be removed. And if you are not yet considered as a bulk sender, it doesn't mean that we will disregard full authentication requirements, because this full authentication is still recommended for your emails to land on inboxes. Email experts are also foreseeing that Google and Yahoo will expand this requirement even to non-bulk senders, so it's best to be covered as early as you can. But for bulk senders, this is a requirement, and based on their announcement, they will be strict in reinforcing it. Now, I won't go into the technical definition of each of these requirements. I will share with you how to set them up later. But what's important to take note of is that these records or authentication requirements are important because they help us protect recipients from malicious messages, and they also help protect businesses or organizations from being impersonated. Specifically, this DMARC record, which is not required for non-bulk senders but is required for bulk senders, is the one that is helping us monitor if our own domains or brands are being impersonated. Now that we've established why it is important for us to authenticate our emails, our next step is to test and understand email authentication, such as we can determine our authentication status and fill the gaps where needed. To make it easy for you to implement this, I created this checklist, which will be a reference throughout the rest of this video, and you may download it via the description box below. We'll start with checking the authentication of our marketing emails. Bulk of our emails are for marketing purposes, and that's why we typically use email service providers or ESPs to deliver them. So here are the steps to test our marketing emails. First, log in to your ESP, that might be Flowdesk, ConvertKit, Kajabi, and then send a test email to your personal Gmail account. Once we receive the email in our personal Gmail account, we check if our email is using a shared domain or a branded domain. And to comply with full authentication requirements, then our email must have been delivered via a branded domain, which looks like this, instead of a shared domain, which looks like this. There is typically via amconvertkit.com or via claviomail.com. In the case of Flowdesk, that would be via amazonses.com or fdske.com. And this is important because our emails won't pass the DMARC authentication if we are using any of these shared domains. If we fail this check, we will address that later when we troubleshoot our marketing emails. But for now, we'll proceed with checking if our 3 required records are present. The way we check this is by clicking this ellipsis icon to the top right of our email, and then clicking this option to show original. Please make sure not to click report spam or phishing because that will affect your sender reputation. Make sure you're just clicking show original. It will lead us to what we call our email header. And within the email header, what we need to look for are 3 records: SPF, DKIM, and DMARC. And if our marketing email is properly authenticated, then all of these records must have a value of a pass. Now, don't worry if you failed any of these checks. We'll look into troubleshooting them. First, if you failed the branded sending domain test, then we have to look into the documentation of our email service provider on how to verify our custom domain. I linked the documentation on how to achieve this across popular ESPs, and note that you have to have access to your DNS records via your domain host. Again, it has to be your domain host and not your website host. In the case of Flowdesk, our first step is to define the sending address. And it should not be a gmail.com or yahoo.com account. It should be a custom domain. So for example, I can add hello at my domain and hit save. Once we've nominated the sender email address, we now need to verify our domain. So this is key for us to be able to send our marketing emails via a branded sending domain. Depending on your ESP, the steps and the interface will of course be different, but the approach will be similar. Across all ESPs, we'll be asked to edit our DNS records, which you'll find via your domain host. In the case of Flowdesk, you may click this verify now option and you have the option to either automatically verify or doing it manually. You may choose either, but I prefer doing it manually so I have more control over what I add to my DNS records. But of course, if you're not confident editing records in your DNS, I recommend getting in touch with your domain host or engaging an expert. Once I click do it manually, it will lead me to these instructions to add DNS records to my domain. If you're using Squarespace domains to host your domain, then this is how the interface will look like. If you're using another domain host like GoDaddy or Namecheap, then they will have a different interface, but you can just look up how to add a DNS, space your domain host, and it will have a similar instruction. So we go to edit DNS. Now we just have to copy these records, but I want us to pay particular attention to the record type. So notice under the record type, we have CNAME for DKIM and SPF, while for DMARC it says text. Now we have to be very careful when we're adding text records like DMARC because this record must not have a duplicate. So first, I will add our CNAME records. We'll start with DKIM. Now, when we look into the full value of this DKIM record, we'll find that they automatically appended the domain. But we have to take note that some domain providers like Squarespace automatically adds this too. So when we add this to our DNS records, we only copy this part without the domain. So when we add the record, we make sure that we're only pasting the first part without the domain. Then the type is CNAME and the alias is this full value. Upon saving this, we'll proceed with our SPF record. Again, this is CNAME. If your ESP is using a text record instead of a CNAME, then pause first and we'll proceed with the next step before adding any text record. In the case of Flowdesk, their SPF record is provided using CNAME, so I'll just go ahead and copy this first part. That's FDESP. And then our record type is CNAME, and the data should be this full value. Now, before we add any text record, I'd like us to look into any custom records within the DNS and check if there is any host that is DMARC and has a type that is text. So we need to make sure that there isn't any duplicate record before we add this DMARC text record from Flowdesk. Another option to check whether you have existing DMARC or SPF text records is to use this DMARCian domain checker, which I'll link down below, and you can simply paste your domain right here, and it will indeed say that you don't have any DMARC record at the moment, so we can proceed with adding the DMARC record. But if you have an existing one, the result will look like this. Notice how under DMARC it says you have this DMARC record already in the domain, and then under SPF you also have an existing SPF record. So to add the DMARC record, we go and set the record type to text, and then our host is _DMARC, and the text is this value that's provided to us. This value is actually standard across any email service provider that you're using. What this means is that we are starting to monitor our DMARC with a P is equal to none. This is just the bare minimum, meaning we are authenticating our emails, but then we are not acting upon it just yet. If we are ready for more advanced authentication, then we can change the value of this P. Also, you'll find that there are documentations that mentions adding an email here where reports will be sent daily, but it's hard to make sense of those reports until you engage an email provider that analyzes DMARC reports for you. So to start with, we can assign P equals none without any email address. This format will still be compliant to current Google and Yahoo requirements. After setting up all these required records, we will have a prompt that we need to wait 48 to 72 hours before our domain is verified. Now, this is how it will look like when your domain has been verified. And once it's verified, you may now test your email again and check whether you've passed all the 3 records. Now, different ESPs would have different ways of implementing these records. Notice how Flowdesk and ConvertKit are almost the same. We have 2 CNAMEs and 1 text. If you set up your verification before 2024, then this may also look different. It's likely that you weren't able to set up DMARC yet. Also, there are email service providers which use text record for SPF. And again, for text records, we need to be careful not to add a duplicate one. So you need to make sure there isn't any existing SPF record before we add this one provided by MailerLite. So most likely, if you've set up the branded sending domain, then you've completed most of the records here. So in the case of Flowdesk, all of these will be in place. But there are cases wherein if you've added these prior to 2024, it could be that you don't have a DMARC record because it was just implemented this year. And so if you don't have that yet, then you just need to add these records. Again, it could be the same across any ESB. Now let's quickly explain what to expect and what it means once our marketing emails are fully authenticated. So this is what it looks like when we are using a shared domain. That means our marketing emails are not fully authenticated. When we inspect the email header, our own email or domain is used in the from field, but then the SPF and DKIM are actually based off of the domain of our email provider, in this case, convertkit.com. This means that the deliverability of the email is also affected by all users who are using this shared IP address. But once we are fully authenticated, then our deliverability is mainly based off of our own domain's reputation. We'll also notice that when we are using a shared domain, our DMARC fails. And that's because for us to pass DMARC authentication, we either need to make sure that this domain in our DKIM record aligns with the domain in our from field, or the return path related to our SPF must align with this from address domain. Now, we cannot see the return path in this email header, but when we look into the finer details of the email header, we'll be able to find the return path address. This is why passing the DMARC is likely only possible if you are using a branded domain instead of a shared domain. Now, this is very important. If you just switch to a branded domain, that means you just configured the DNS for your domain to be verified. We need to make sure we increase sending volume slowly. This is called warming or ramping up your sending infrastructure because we're just starting to build our domain's sender reputation. So it is recommended that within the first 2 to 4 weeks, we start by sending emails to our most engaged segments first, and then slowly increase the volume daily or weekly depending on your sending cadence. Now, once we've successfully authenticated our marketing emails, we may now proceed with authenticating our direct emails. Now, using the same email that we've already authenticated using Flowdesk, I now sent a direct email to my personal Gmail account. And then when I click this Show Original option, our goal is to check our headers again and make sure that we have these 3 records, SPF, DKIM, and DMARC, and the value should all be pass. And this may look different on your end depending on how you were onboarded when you created your Google Workspace or your Microsoft account. But then in my case, I haven't really set up the SPF and the DKIM, particularly for Google Workspace. And so it's returning as neutral, which is actually a soft fail. And then the DKIM is pass, but then the domain is not using my own domain, which is theartistscientist.com. And to address this authentication error for our direct emails, we need to set up SPF and DKIM specific to our email provider. So we can look into this document. Now, under this troubleshooting direct email authentication document, you'll find that the step 1 is to again check existing records. We need to make sure that we're not adding additional text records, particularly SPF and DMARC. So I added the same link to the demarcian.com. Note though that especially if you've already authenticated your marketing campaigns, it's likely that you already have a DMARC record in place. So the results will look like this, and typically it has a yellow warning. It says that your DMARC record is valid, but then there's room for improvement. So when you're just starting out monitoring these authentication, it's totally fine for our p-value to be none. But if you'd like to have more enhanced security, then that's the time we can consider a value different from none. Notice though that we don't have the SPF and DKIM in place. Note that if you're using other ESPs like MailerLite, Squarespace email, and others, you might find that the SPF record was already added when you verified the sending domain. So just be careful not to add another one if you already have an existing one. In our case, we use Flowdesk, and Flowdesk is using CNAME instead of text to assign SPF. And what that means is that they are not assigning the SPF to our root domain. What I mean with the subdomain is this part. When we click this caret, there's mailed by, and this is the SPF that we set up for Flowdesk. It's fdsp.r domain. And if you're using ConvertKit, for example, it will be ckspa.yourdomain. But for our root domain, we haven't implemented SPF just yet. And so here are the instructions if you are using Google Workspace for your direct emails. This is the baseline values. Notice how it says the host must be at, the record type is text, and the value is as such. The value is where we specify the servers and IP address that we allow to send emails on our behalf. So in this case, we are allowing the Google Workspace, hence the SPF for Google. But if you also would like to explicitly mention that you would like to include Squarespace Mail or MailerLite or Amazon, then this is how we merge SPF records, because as I mentioned, you need to only have a single text record for SPF. So if you need to indicate more servers or IP address, this is how we merge them. So if I am to add this text record, all I need to do is, again, add a record here. The host is at, the record type is text, and then because I just would like to specify that I would like to send from Google Workspace, I just use this value under data. And again, if you need to specify other services, then we can include that here. For example, this one is Squarespace email. But in our case, the SPF that we've already set up for Flowdesk is sufficient. We don't need to add Flowdesk's servers here. Now we've already added DMARC, so I don't need to implement that in this particular use case, but we don't have any DKIM just yet for Google Workspace. Yes, we have a DKIM record for Flowdesk, but we also need to have one for Google Workspace. And note that we can have multiple DKIM records. I linked the help guide to turn on DKIM authentication. So just click this link or go to Google Workspace and then Gmail. Then we'll have this option to authenticate email. Simply click this. Then we need to select our domain in this dropdown. And once we click this button to generate a new record, it will generate the DKIM record that we will add to our domain host. This prompt will show up, and note that we have the option to change to a 1024-bit length. I recommend 2048 because this is more secure, but if you try to paste this and your domain host is not able to accommodate this much characters, then you can choose the 1024 option. Leave this prefix selector as is and hit generate. Now we might need to refresh the page and then make sure that the selected domain is correct. Then we'll notice that we'll have this records to add to our domain. the DNS hostname, Google domain key, and the unique text record value. This is a text record again, so just make sure there isn't any similar text record with the Google domain key host. So if I copy this, I just need to add this to the host name, and then the type is text, and then the value should be this text record value. So I'll just paste it here and hit the save button. So as I mentioned, if it does not save, that might mean that your domain provider doesn't support the 2048-bit length, so you can just switch to the 1024 one. After adding the DKIM record, we click this button, Start Authentication. Upon refresh, we'll find that the status will be authenticating email with DKIM, and the button right here will be Stop Authentication. This means that we are now authenticating with the DKIM record. However, if it doesn't show up for you immediately, we may wait for up to 48 hours because it might take a while before the DNS fully propagates. Once we've completed the troubleshooting steps, we may now repeat the testing. So we'll send a test email again to our personal Gmail account, and then we'll look into our email headers and make sure that SPF, DKIM, and DMARC have the value pass. After authenticating our direct emails, we may now proceed with testing our transactional emails. And these emails may come from a lot of different sources, so it's best to list down first all the services that you use to send emails on your behalf. Here are some examples. It can be your CRM like Dubsado or Honeybook, or it can be your website host, Shopify or Squarespace or Webflow, and then it can also be your payment gateway like Thrivecart or Samcart. It's important to note though that most of these transactional emails do not necessarily use our domain in the from address. So for example, in the case of Honeybook, they are using their own domain. Hence, all of these records, SPF, DKIM, and DMARC, have the pass value. And because they are not using our domain in the from field in these emails, this will not affect our sender reputation. This is different from marketing emails, which typically use our domain in the from field header. However, most of these services also offer the option for you to use your custom domain in sending these transactional emails. In that case, then that's when we need to check again our SPF, DMARC, and DKIM for those emails. So I highly recommend that you audit each of your transactional emails from different providers and then go through these authentication steps to check whether the from address is using your domain. If so, then we need to make sure that our SPF, DKIM, and DMARC are in place. For Shopify transactions, this is how authentication will look like. If under notifications you are using your branded domain as the sender, then to pass all the authentication steps, we need to authenticate our domain. This will again prompt us to enter necessary CNAME records specific for Shopify. And after following these steps, your Shopify transaction emails will now be authenticated. I hope you find this helpful to enhance the security and deliverability of your emails. Much as I'd love to help you, I won't be able to offer personalized support via the comments below, but I do offer high-touch support inside my programs for designers, Standout Squarespace and Standout Shopify. I'm also happy to recommend skilled experts from my program to help you with email deliverability and domain authentication.